This video is about the causes of biodiversity loss across the globe. For starters, biodiversity is defined as a variety of traits in living organisms across all levels of biological organization. There are three levels of biodiversity: species diversity, ecosystem diversity, and genetic diversity. Biodiversity is extremely important because all the species are interconnected and depend on one another. As biodiversity decreases, these connections weaken and harm all the species in the ecosystem. Due to a decrease in biodiversity, scientists estimate that species are dying out at hundreds of times the natural rate. Pollution, overfishing, and overhunting are just a few causes of biodiversity loss. To wrap up this introduction, the major causes of biodiversity loss are climate change, habitat change, invasive species pollution, and overexploitation, also known as CHIPO. The loss of biodiversity impacts everything. If a solution does not arise, then the consistent loss of biodiversity will become an even bigger issue. It is known that climate change is a huge issue and it is only getting increasingly worse. Climate change impacts the entire planet and all that is living on it. Three things impacted by climate change are coral reefs, insects, and bird migration. Starting with coral reefs, climate change has been causing them to die, resulting in white, dead-looking coral. Charlie Veron, who is an Australian marine biologist, said, "There is no hope of reefs surviving to even mid-century in any form that we now recognize," followed up by saying that when coral reefs die out, they will take about 1/3 of the world's marine biodiversity. Insects are also affected by climate change. Their mortality has decreased, they arrive to their habitats earlier and have a higher overwintering survival, as well as more generations born within a year. Next comes the impact of climate change on bird migration. They migrate when there is an increase in daylight, and they migrate because they're seeking food and new nesting locations. Climate change affects much more than those three branches of biodiversity, but they are great examples of how climate change impacts biodiversity loss. The next cause of biodiversity loss is habitat change. Habitat change is when temperature, moisture, sunlight, and species change. There are two different ways to alter habitat, and those are natural and anthropogenic. Natural habitat change consists of wind, fire, or water, and anthropogenic habitat change consists of agriculture, forestry, or urbanization. Habitat fragmentation is defined by breaking up one continuous type of habitat into fragments, which has beneficial and detrimental impacts on biodiversity. Habitat changes cause isolated areas, decreases habitat size, and decreases interior area. Biodiversity is heavily impacted by habitat change. The next cause of biodiversity loss is invasive species. This factor of biodiversity loss is very detrimental to different habitats. By definition, an invasive species is a non-native species that becomes dominant in a community. A direct example would be the emerald ash borer, originally from Asia, that has killed millions of ash trees, especially in Minnesota. The zebra mussel is another direct example of an invasive species in Minnesota. This species can cause problems for cities by clogging water intakes, hurting swimmers by cutting their feet because they are attached to rocks, swim rafts or ladders, and reducing performance of boat motors by being attached to them. Those species severely harm biodiversity, right here in Minnesota. Another cause of biodiversity loss is pollution. Two main sources of pollution that impact biodiversity are air pollution and water pollution. Air pollution seriously affects biodiversity through nutrient loading of nitrogen and phosphorus. This is a cause of biodiversity loss and ecosystem dysfunction. Falling under water pollution, there is a chemical and thermal pollution, consisting of sediment, fertilizer, urban runoff, sewage treatment, or industrial facilities. Pollution truly dedicates to the loss of biodiversity. The next cause of biodiversity loss is overexploitation. This subject is very detrimental to biodiversity. Overexploitation exists with food, medicine, pets, ornamental things, or so-called aphrodisiacs. Two great examples are rhino horn and aquatic exploitation. Rhino horn is used as an aphrodisiac or as a supposed medicine for anything from cancer to snake bites. This has hurt the rhino population very much. Aquatic exploitation is when recreational fisheries impact habitat and biodiversity. Aquatic exploitation results in fish stocks in danger of collapse, fish habitat under threat of degradation, and fish populations vulnerable to collapse. Overexploitation of natural resources leads to extreme loss of biodiversity. In conclusion, it is important to understand what impacts biodiversity negatively. Climate change has been addressed in the world, but our current president is acting like it is fake. Habitat change has been addressed, yet there are still greedy people taking advantage of the forest. Invasive species exist, with signs at your local lake telling you to check for zebra mussels, yet people will still transfer species to where they should not be. Pollution is a well-known factor of biodiversity loss, yet fossil fuels are still the main source of energy and corporations still think it is okay to put emissions in the atmosphere. Overexploitation is well known and there is a black market for things that are exploited, yet there has not been enough done to halt these illegal trades and exploitations of natural resources. There are many different factors to biodiversity loss, and it is time to address those and try to find a solution. Hopefully, global leaders will be able to address these factors and come up with a remedy. That would be ideal for all creatures who inhabit this planet we call home.